We are unveiling a new Q&A podcast in 2 weeks with a new host and all new guests, but with the same goal of giving you the opportunity to hear from intriguing people who are making things happen. But this week, here's an episode from our Afterwards podcast archive from October 2023 with Martin Barron, former executive editor of The Washington Post, on his book Collision of Power. He's interviewed by NPR's media correspondent, David Folkenflik.
Hi, this is Rachel from C-SPAN's podcast team. And before we get to this week's episode, I'd like to introduce you to one of the producers here at C-SPAN, my colleague Sean.
Thanks, Rachel. If you're a fan of Q&A, we think you'll also like our evening newsletter, Word for Word, which brings you a recap of the day's most important political and policy events, delivered right to your inbox. Read about what happened on Capitol Hill and at the White House, and watch video highlights featuring the day's newsmakers. Hear them word for word.
Join our community of informed listeners and viewers. Head over to cspan.org/connect and subscribe to Word for Word today.
Thanks for listening and staying connected with Word for Word. Subscribe now at cspan.org/connect. Thank you.
Martin Barron, of course, has been the top editor at such newspapers as the Miami Herald, the Boston Globe, and most recently the Washington Post, adamant along the way that the journalist isn't the story. But Marty Barron, you decided to write your own. Tell us how you came to the decision to write this memoir titled Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post.
Well, I knew that I was living through history, an important moment in history for the United States, and an important moment for the press and for the Washington Post. So the paper was sold by a family that had owned it, the Graham family, for 80 years, was then sold to one of the richest people in the world. And then along comes a presidential candidate unlike any we'd ever seen before, and a president unlike any we'd ever seen before. And so I was living through history, an important moment, as I say, in American history and for democracy. And I thought somebody should tell that story. I was at the Post for more than 8 years during that story. And I think at some point somebody should tell that story, and I was the one to do it.
You know, you had been previously, as I mentioned, at these other papers. At the Boston Globe, although an important regional newspaper, not one followed by all of America, you really became much more of a household name and figure thanks to the movie Spotlight, which looked at what your enterprising core of investigative reporters did to expose the astonishing range of the child abuse crisis in the Catholic Church in Boston and, as it turned out, beyond. What was it like to have been one of the key subjects of this major Hollywood film before ascending to the national scene in sort of your own right, as you did at the Washington Post?
Yeah, well, the film actually came out not long after I joined the Post. So I joined the Post in the beginning of 2013, and the movie came out. It was a 2015 movie. So it came out as I was at the Post. It was, look, I mean, I don't think any journalist does or should work to be portrayed in a movie, and we certainly did not do that at the Boston Globe. In fact, the first entreaties that we got from Hollywood to have a movie made, we rejected. But then many years later, we were approached again, and we thought it was an important story to be told, the story of how investigative reporting works, the story of listening to survivors, holding powerful institutions to account, basically explaining how investigative reporting works and why it's important in this country. So that to me was the importance of the movie. Obviously, it gave me some degree of celebrity, I guess, minor celebrity, I would say. But it's not something I expected, not something I was seeking. It just happened to me. And you try to use it for a good purpose. I try to use it for the purpose of talking about the role of an independent and free press in this country, and frankly, around the world. So that's what I endeavored to do with that recognition in the movie.
And the timing, of course, being important, as you corrected me for that, and I appreciate that. Beyond that question, beyond that, that I'm sure out-of-body experience in some ways for you, what was it like to take the step from going from this, incredible, important legacy newspaper, the Boston Globe, to something of the stature of the Washington Post? The journalism in some ways is the same. What made this so different?
Well, I was joining a newspaper that had a national and international reputation. It was almost certainly best known for its role in the Watergate investigation, which ended up bringing down a president of the United States. It had been, even if it had not been read around the country, people around the country were certainly familiar with it, had an image of the Washington Post from perhaps the movie All the President's Men that was about the Watergate investigation. And so, you're moving I was moving to the nation's capital and knew that I was be covering the most important stories in the country on a regular basis. And so you recognize that there's a huge responsibility there. Obviously, I was sort of confronting the legacy of Ben Bradlee, a legendary editor of the Washington Post, and people asked me whether I was intimidated by that, and I said that I wasn't intimidated by it, but I was inspired by it, and that is in fact the case. So there was a legacy that I felt that I needed to uphold, a certain set of institutional standards that had been set down by the Graham family and by Ben Bradlee, by his successors as editor as well. And so it's a huge weight on your shoulder, frankly. And I felt that going to the Post. But I also knew that they had an enormous number of financial difficulties at the time, that they were kind of at sea, as many news organizations were in this country, particularly newspapers, and that it was going to be an enormous challenge.
What were the stakes for you, personally and professionally?
Well, I was secure at the Boston Globe, although I was frankly ready to move on. I had been there for 11 and a half years. It seemed like a good time to move on, and they too were facing enormous financial pressures, although we had recovered really from the worst. You never know how things are going to work out once you go to a new news organization. They may not like you, you may not like the place, all of that. But I had taken risks before in my career. I had left the Los Angeles Times, where I had worked for 17 years, and I went to the New York Times. You never know how that's going to work out. Then I went in 2000, I went to the Miami Herald to be editor there, working for a publisher who was new to me at the time. And then I went to the Boston Globe, where I really didn't know. I knew hardly anybody in the city, really only one couple, and I knew nobody in the newsroom. And so that was a risk. So I was accustomed to risks, and I felt that this was one that was well worth taking, both professionally for me, and that I thought, if I did a good job, that we could do something really worthwhile for the Washington Post. And in doing something worthwhile for the Washington Post, I felt that we would be doing something worthwhile for the country.
You were hired, if I recall correctly, by one of the sort of scions, in a sense, of the Graham family. Catherine Weymouth was the publisher at the time, the niece of Don Graham, the former chairman of that company. And she brought you on board relatively soon in your tenure there. She met with you to explain that she would not be your boss any longer. And in fact, there would be a transition in ownership. What happened, and how did you absorb this new information?
She invited me to have a drink at a hotel across the street from what was then the Post headquarters, sort of iconic building in that sense. And that was surprising to me because it was at about 5 o'clock. We didn't normally have drinks at 5 o'clock. I was busy. That's about getting close to deadline time. And so I had a sense that something might be up. You develop a second sense after a while in this business. I'd gone through a lot of turmoil in the news business. And, when somebody says, let's have a drink at 5 o'clock and you're not expecting it, you think something might be up. But I did not expect this. I did not expect that the Graham family would be selling the Post. I don't think anybody expected that. The family had been incredibly devoted to the Post for 80 years. The name of the parent company was the Washington Post Company, and the name of our newspaper was the Washington Post. So this was a total surprise to me. My feelings were mixed at the time. I guess my initial reaction was that, first of all, shock, but second of all, that it might be good for the Post. The truth is that we or at least the Graham family and everybody had pretty much run out of ideas for how to turn the place around. And we were facing an enormous number of cuts. I was beginning to develop plans for the next year, budget plans, and they called for more cuts in staff. I had already done I was expected to do about cutting 35 people in our newsroom in the first year. They said they were going easy on me, and then the second year was going to be more like 50 or more. And I expected that perpetually, frankly. So I was somewhat encouraged that somebody who had a reputation for growth would be purchasing the Post, that he would invest, that he would come with some new ideas, because Lord knows we needed a lot of fresh ideas in the business. So I thought it might be good for the Post, but I didn't know if it was going to be good for me. The usual equation is new owner, new editor. I expected that I might be dismissed, and that Jeff Bezos would find a new editor.
Not what happened, as it turned out. Bezos, in some ways, one could look empirically at, strands from a Wikipedia entry and say, well, here's a guy who should have been a walking conflict of interest, who had so much business in front of the government and wanted more, who turned out wanted to develop things in Washington, D.C., who it turned out got involved in personal scandal and controversies with an ensuing president. But there's a constant thread through the book about, it's really an admiration of who the kinds of values Bezos expressed and also the kind of civic leader he turned out to be. Talk a little bit about that. What is there that is so admirable about Jeff Bezos, but also of his stewardship of this important press institution?
Yeah, I guess this is a surprise for a lot of people, because a lot of people have a clear image of him based on what they've read or seen in a different context than the Washington Post. What I wrote about was my own personal experience with him, what I personally observed at the Washington Post, his ownership, his management of the place, and of me and other people on the staff. And so, certainly he has huge commercial interests. I mean, there's no doubting that. And he's a controversial figure for a variety of reasons, from labor practices at Amazon to intrusions into privacy to their lobbying efforts in Washington, you name it, their whole range of things. So, and it was our duty to investigate all that, of course, and to continue doing so despite his ownership. Even so, my experience was that he was going to give us our independence, and did give us our independence completely. He said at his first meeting with the staff in a town hall meeting that we could cover him and cover Amazon any way we'd liked, without any interference on his part. And he reiterated that on several occasions to me, and that's exactly what we did. We certainly put it to the test. We covered aggressively issues at Amazon. We covered aggressively all aspects of that company and of him, his own personal life when he got divorced and had an affair, and you name it. And he did this while coming under tremendous pressure from Donald Trump, who was initially the presidential candidate and then president, clearly, I would say, the most powerful person in the world, and who was regularly attacking Jeff Bezos and seeking to undermine his business, and clearly the primary source of his wealth. So, and he stood by us throughout the whole time. He never caved. He never submitted to that pressure. He didn't interfere in the content of our coverage in any way, even when it was about Amazon, when it was about himself. In no instance did he interfere in the coverage. It
seemed to me over time as an outside observer that if anything, your coverage of Amazon only became more rigorous and tougher and more deeply diving into questions that Amazon as a corporation may not have wanted great public scrutiny, right? That you guys felt comfortable doing that. Let's get into the journalism that you experienced. And let's start with an early example of it. The question of Barton Gellman, a former Washington Post national security reporter, walks in with what is in some ways one of the scoops of the new century. And it's what people now think of as the Snowden papers. Talk about the challenge that presented and the opportunity it afforded you as a relatively new editor at the Post.
Yeah, well, Bart came into our newsroom and he informed us that he had these incredibly sensitive documents or access to them or was going to get access to them. And that he wanted to know, and they were going to reveal a surveillance regime on the part of the intelligence community in the United States, a surveillance practices that swept in a lot of information about American citizens, as well as on citizens around the world. And he wanted to know whether this is something that we would be willing to publish. And we listened to him. He was very careful. He was very thoughtful. He was very cautious, extremely cautious. You know, it was clear to me that he was explaining something that would be of not just a curiosity, but actually of true public interest. Because one thing I think Americans value, and that I personally value, is privacy. And I think we should value privacy in this country. And this was an exceptional intrusion into the privacy of Americans. And so, you know, one of our primary principles in publishing national security information is whether there's a true public interest at stake. So I indicated that we were willing to go ahead with that. And then that evening, I thought a lot about it because, look, I mean, this is hugely sensitive information, the most confidential information in the U.S. government. It came at a time of deep public concern about terrorism. I had lived through 9/11, of course. I had been in Boston at the time. Two of the planes flew out of Logan Airport in Boston. Those two planes are the ones that hit the World Trade Center towers. I was very sensitive to that. And so, you know, I was very concerned that we do the right thing, that we not endanger national security, but also that we make the public aware of a level of surveillance that was certainly not public knowledge, and which I don't think that a lot of Americans would have approved of if they had known. And so I thought a lot about it that evening. I did some research. I had printed out the Espionage Act of 1917. I was highlighting it. I thought more about it. I was thinking maybe I should change course, but as I thought more about it, I thought, no, I think this is the right thing to do.
Why'd you print out the Espionage Act? Why was it important for the executive editor of the Washington Post to look at the actual text of that century-old law to help gauge whether or not this was right to print?
Because there was a risk to the institution that I represented. To the Washington Post, it could have suffered huge fines. It's possible that people on staff, including ownership, could have been sent to prison. It's possible that we could have been prosecuted. That had not happened in the history of the United States, but it didn't mean that it couldn't happen. And so I thought that I should take a look at the law and think about it, and think about the risks that publication posed to the institution. I think that's the responsible thing to do. And I did think about it, and I knew that this was putting the institution potentially at risk. And ultimately, within days, I told my publisher, Catherine Weymouth, and the CEO of the parent company, Don Graham. I told Catherine Weymouth. She told Don Graham. And they trusted us to make the right call, and they did not interfere. They trusted my judgment, they trusted Bart's judgment, and allowed us to proceed.
You talk about the importance of privacy, which I think was a key element of what was shown that in the Obama years, that was still being sort of disregarded in some ways when national security was invoked by senior intelligence officials and the like. I wondered if we could play out that question as it confronted you in the years that followed. As it turned out, so much hacking happened of key political figures in the 2016 race, particularly targeting the Democrats as a source of disruption and then more, that it was a treasure trove for news organizations as well as for political actors on the scene. And if I recall correctly, the Post was among those that reported aggressively when it felt the news was warranted. How do you, in retrospect, you come down on that? about the use of such materials and about the sort of principles that should guide the use of such materials, given that it's both revelatory and incredibly intrusive?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really important question that the press needs to grapple with. We were the first to report that the Democratic National Committee computers had been hacked. We certainly raised the question, the likelihood that this was done by Russia. Russia, in some sort of collaboration, maybe not formal, but indirect, was providing information to WikiLeaks, which then released that information, and a lot of these emails. Very hard to ignore. You can't really ignore those emails. You can't pretend that that didn't happen. And in fact, those emails were creating a stir even within the Democratic Party, whether we and we're going to create a controversy whether we were interested in publishing them or not. The reality is that they suggested that the Democratic National Committee, its leadership, was favoring the Hillary Clinton candidacy over Bernie Sanders. And ultimately, they revealed some speeches that Hillary Clinton had given on Wall Street and how much she was paid for those speeches, and the content of those speeches, which was highly controversial as well. So I don't think we could just ignore that. At the same time, though, I mean, I think that we probably, if I were to do this over again, is that I would devote as much in the way of resources to the origin of that, to the hacking itself, to the reasons for the hacking, to the motives for that hacking, as we did to the content of those emails. So I think we needed to do both, and I think we focused overwhelmingly on the content of the emails. We certainly highlighted that Russia was likely involved. But, you know, we did less on that at the time than we did on the content of the emails. And part of the reason for that is that the intelligence leadership was unwilling at that point to say that Russia was responsible for that or that it happened for nefarious purposes. But it did seem, it emerged, of course, that Russia was seeking to help the Trump campaign. That was the ultimate conclusion of the intelligence community. And I think that that's a theme that we should have emphasized more forcefully sooner in the coverage of that campaign.
It's funny, I remember a conversation I had with Donna Brazile, who was a top Democratic Party leader as well as a CNN pundit at the time. And she just said, David, I'm not going to respond to the substance of the questions, which I personally found pretty interesting in the moment, because I don't want to give credence to the idea that it's okay for foreign actors to steal essentially private communications. And, that did set me back. That made me think a little bit about the story I was doing at the time. And it made me think about this question. Obviously, we've all now had to think about this question a lot. Does it matter if such material comes from somebody who presents as a whistleblower, as Edward Snowden did, or somebody who presents as a chaos creator, as the agents acting on behalf of the Russian government does? Or does it matter most that the material itself is of important public knowledge?
Yeah, well, those are all really good questions, David. I think that's something we have to grapple with. As I said, I don't see how we can ignore the information. I recognize that our appetite for that information is going to be an incentive for people to hack in the first place, because they know that we're going to eat it up and that we're going to publish it and we're going to jump on it and all of that. I do think that, as I say, what I think we need to do is really balance that with our coverage of the motives for that information being released in the first place. And so I think that's what we should have done more of that in that particular presidential election.
So let's turn to Trump now. There's a moment in the book where you write that in preparation for Trump, I could be getting the timing slightly off, but I think it was after he was elected, but before he took office, that you set aside, I believe, half dozen books to read, among them Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny, another about how democracies fall apart, and a few others. What did you read and what did you take from your self-assigned curriculum there?
Well, I took from that Trump had real authoritarian impulses, that a lot of what he had said and a lot of what he had done suggested that he had not only admired authoritarian leaders around the world, which he had kind of made clear at that point, but that he actually would like to have authoritarian powers. And so I was very sensitive to the kinds of measures that he might put in place that would allow him to act in a more authoritarian way. There were a lot. I mean, his, I think, condoning of violence at his rallies was an example of that. He always found an excuse for that violence, usually by saying, well, they were angry, as if that were some sort of justification for violence, which, of course, it's not. His admiration for certain foreign leaders, his willingness to demonize, certainly the press, but demonize the language that he used about globalists and all of that sort of thing, some of which actually verged on being anti-Semitic, I think you could say. So all of that, I think, suggested that he had authoritarian tendencies, and that was something that needed to inform our reporting on him. And I needed to keep that in mind.
It sounds like you wanted to go in very clear-eyed about what you perceived his operating framework and instinctive approach to power was. Yet when asked about your own approach to this, you said, we're not going to war, we're going to work. Tell me what you meant by that, and then about the public discussion that ensued.
Sure. Well, keep in mind, on the very first day of Trump's presidency, he went to the CIA, and speaking to agents there in front of a memorial for fallen CIA agents, what did he do? He decided to talk about the press. And he said, as you know, I'm at war with the media. The message that I took from that is that he was seeking to enlist those agents in his own war with the media, because here he was, the president of the United States, who was at war. And they worked for the president of the United States. So a couple of weeks later, I was asked for my reaction, and I said, we're not at war with the administration, we are at work. So what did I mean by that? I meant that we have to remember what our fundamental mission is here in our profession, and we have to think back to why we have a First Amendment in this country, why we have a free and independent press in this country. And James Madison, who was the principal author of the First Amendment, he talked about freely examining public characters and measures. So let's dissect that. First of all, freely operating independently, examining, meaning it's not stenography, meaning that we actually hold government officials to account, we hold politicians to account, we hold the powerful individuals and institutions that influence public policy to account. Examining. The public characters are the politicians, the other government officials, and the people who influence them, and the measures are the policies that are implemented. So that is why we have a First Amendment in this country. That was the original intent. It's something that I believe any president should understand, particularly if they're taking an oath to the Constitution of the United States, which they do. And it's something that we in the press have to always keep in mind. Our job is not stenography, it is journalism. And journalism goes beyond simply recording what people say, but really looking at who's behind these policies, who are the policies intended to benefit, what kind of practical impact will they have, what are the motives, you name it, all of these sorts of things. And that's what I wanted us to do. And so my view is that it's not a war, it's work. That is our work. It's been our work from the very beginning. And so that was the statement that I was making. We're not doing this out of any animus toward Donald Trump. We're not doing it this is something that was done with previous presidents as well. It always has been. Any fair examination of the history of the Washington Post or other media organizations, and even at the local level, that is what the press has done and what it should do. So my view is this is not war, this is work.
And yet it sparked in some quarters, including some newsrooms, including some corners of your newsroom, the response that, this isn't enough. This isn't sufficient to meet the moment. Media critics like Jay Rosen made that case, but there are journalists who would argue that as well. Why, in your view, is that wrong? Why, in your view, is it inappropriate, as comes across strongly in the pages of this book, to step outside conventional values in the face of an almost unprecedented stance from a president and administration towards the not just the credibility, but the legitimacy of the press itself.
Yeah, well, I think that if we present ourselves as partisans, if we are partisans, then we lose credibility with the public. Our job is our job is to hold all politicians to account. I don't care what party they're in. I don't care what their ideology is. If it's a Democratic president, we have an obligation to do that as well. So I don't see ourselves as being in a war here, and I don't think it's actually necessary. In fact, I think it's destructive, and it erodes public confidence. And if we are seen as partisans, if we act like partisans, and if we see ourselves in a war, then we begin to act like partisans. And I don't want us to act like partisans. I want us to just be journalists, and that is to, as I say, certainly to do a lot of reporting, to be rigorous, to be comprehensive, to understand that our goal is to gather the facts, to get at the truth as best we can, and then tell the public what we've really found. We're not hiding that from the public. There's no point in doing all this reporting unless we're going to tell the public what we found. So I think that works really well, and I think also think our history, the history of the press, shows that it does have a huge impact. I can point to a lot of journalism that had huge impact, whether it's the Watergate investigation at the Washington Post, the Pentagon Papers work at the New York Times. A whole range of coverage over a long period of time that was not partisan in nature, that was simply fulfilling our mission as journalists. And I think that has a lot more credibility with the public, and should have a lot more credibility with the public. And as soon as we think that we are warriors as opposed to journalists, I think we're going down the wrong path.
Well, and certainly, during your tenure, during the Trump term, the Post did an astonishing array of not just political coverage, but accountability reporting, investigative reporting. Whether it involved the Secret Service, it involved questions about what was happening on the border with Mexico and the treatment of people coming into this country without documentation or legal status. Or whether it was David Fahrenthold, essentially crowdsourcing questions about what Trump had done with charitable donations. Talk a little bit about the inventiveness that went into what the Post did in trying to surround this, completely unconventional politician at the head of the levers of the American government.
Well, a lot of it was traditional, and some of it was new. So what David Fahrenthold did, for example, was new. I mean, initially we reported on, Trump had ducked out of a debate, and he held a rally, said he was going to give a donation to veterans groups, and all David did was really just follow up and try to find out, okay, where'd the money go? Who was it given to? And the Trump team couldn't give a straight answer as to where the money went. So he went onto social media, which in a previous era would not have been available to us, to find out, asking whether any veterans groups got this money. And he wasn't hearing back that anybody got the money. So
just to stop you for a second, Marty, I mean, he took, if I recall correctly, a notepad in which he would write things out and say, this is what I got. Can you guys add to it? It was almost as though you were sitting over the reporter's shoulder watching him do his work. It was incredibly engaging, almost entertaining gamification of the idea of some rather serious reporting.
That's true. That's true. And David was brilliant at it and inventive, and came up with some real creative approaches to practicing journalism. And they worked in the current era where social media is so important. And it did give them insight into what he had and what he didn't have, and to see whether they could add to his knowledge. And it did force Donald Trump to actually distribute that money. And he finally informed him that he had. I mean, the Trump team had already said that they had already done that, but there was no evidence that it had. And then they did it after he reported on all that.
Throughout the book, you're very generous about pointing out the insights and the muscularity of the reporting and the editing of your colleagues there. It did seem as though with Farenthold, there was one moment at which you said, well, if he's doing this, meaning Trump, with this one charity, what's to say he's not doing this with all kinds of other things? And sort of almost launched Farenthold on a cottage industry of reports on this. How important is, you were editor of the Globe for, I think, 11 years and of the Post for 9, if I'm not mistaken. How important? Go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
A little over 8. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A little over 8. How important is the tone set from the top for an editor? How much can you steer these battleships in appreciable ways over the course of a tenure?
Yeah, well, a newsroom is a collaborative enterprise. You work together. I think that's it's one of the things maybe that's being lost when people are not actually in the office. So I often use the example of this Farenthold example. So we ran into each other at the elevator bank. I congratulated David on the work that he had done, talked about how great it was. And then as I was speaking, I don't know, it just occurred to me to ask him. I said, well, if Trump did this sort of thing with something that was so public, what really happened with all his supposed charitable donations that were done, that were supposedly made without a lot of public attention? And I don't think it would have occurred to me really to ask unless I had just bumped into David at the elevator bank. And he took that and he ran with it. And he recognized, I think, a good idea and did a brilliant job with that. That kind of serendipity happens a lot in newsrooms, at least when people were actually showing up in newsrooms physically. And I think it's incredibly important. So the editor can have a tremendous influence in a lot of different ways. Certainly you can order up stories, but it's better to actually have conversations with people on the staff, ask a lot of questions. I think it's important to just ask questions and draw people out to see what are the unanswered issues. So same with the Secret Service. Carol Leonnig had written a couple of stories about the Secret Service that showed real mishaps and blunders on their part. And I asked Carol whether this was part of a bigger pattern, whether there's a systemic problem at the Secret Service, because these were incredibly embarrassing incidents. And we held a meeting, and Carol indicated that she had leads on some other stories, and that it did look like a bigger problem. And so there was a group of editors in my office, and we authorized her to spend full time on that, and she did, and produced a tremendous series of stories about the Secret Service and its blunders, and that won a Pulitzer Prize for her and for the Washington Post.
Once I'm hearing you say this out loud, it does remind me a little bit of the genesis of course, the great spotlight reporting on the Catholic Church. How much did that, prompted in part by your prodding, really at the very opening stanzas of your tenure as editor in Boston, how much did that influence your thinking about things systemically in that way?
Well, I was really from the very beginning. First, I just wanted to get to the basic facts. I think it's really important for people in editing roles and reporters as well to just keep asking questions like, what don't we know? What do we need to know? What are the unanswered questions? To what extent has truth been left unknown? Is there a way to get at it? So in the case of the Catholic Church, when I arrived in Boston, there was a column written by a fantastic columnist, Eileen McNamara. She talked about this case of a priest having been accused of abusing as many as 80 kids. And at the end of the column, she said the truth may never be known because these documents that might reveal it were under court seal. And at the time, the lawyer for the plaintiff said the cardinal himself was aware of this abuse and yet reassigned this priest from parish to parish without telling anybody. And the archdiocese denied it, said it was absolutely not true. And so at my first meeting on my first day working at the Boston Globe, everybody talked at their meeting about what they were doing for the day, and nobody happened to mention this particular case. And I said, well, what about this? This is an incredibly important story. If it's true that the cardinal really knew about this abuse and reassigned this priest and essentially enabled him to abuse again and again. And I asked, can't we get at the truth? Can't we get it beyond one side saying one thing and one side saying something else? And people pointed out that the documents were under seal. And I said that I knew that because I'd read that. But had we thought about going to court to get those documents, arguing that there's a public interest in it. And certainly people were surprised to hear that suggestion at that first meeting. But we did talk to our lawyer later, and then we launched a parallel investigation, journalistic investigation, talking to survivors, talking to lawyers, talking to anybody we could, priests. And we produced that set of stories beginning in January of 2002. And over the course of the next year and a half, we probably produced about 900 stories. And we can still see the impact of that set of stories today.
Very much so. That idea of can't we get at the truth undergirds much of what you present in this book, of your experience, your perspective of your years at the Post. To take it back to the Trump years, it seems to me that you were editor at a time when you, as an editor, the Post as a newsroom, we all, as part of this nation, experienced sort of a series of, shocks to the system. The election of Trump and the just completely unprecedented nature of that administration, from stem to stern, really, until what we saw January 6th on his way out. The Me Too movement that really exploded, I would say, in 2017, starting really in 2016, and changing the nature of how many journalists looked at reporting on questions of abuse of, mistreatment of, harassment of women in the workplace and beyond. And then, of course, the social justice movement that exploded in the streets, but really also in the newsrooms across the country with the murder of George Floyd and subsequent events and revelations about how law enforcement and other systems work. It seemed to me that was in a relatively short number of years, some pretty major social upheaval, and not just recalibration, but rethinking, tectonic plates on the move at times, in ways that were hard for news leaders to manage, as their own journalists started questioning prior assumptions. How did that play out at the Post, and how did that play out for you as the news executive atop that newsroom?
Yeah, well, I think that covers a lot of subjects there. So how it played out a little bit different from one subject to the next. But, I think that people started to feel a need to express themselves more, particularly on social media. They had strong views about what was happening in this country in terms of racial justice, in terms of justice for women who had been harassed or assaulted, obviously, for all of what was happening in the Trump administration, where there appeared to be an attack, or was an attack, on basic public civility, on free expression, on norms of political discourse, all of that, on civil rights, people felt. So I think people were motivated to express themselves more, particularly on social media. And that was not something that I was in favor of. I remain strongly opposed to that. I don't think it's helpful to us. I keep asking people, can you show me the journalist tweet that changed the world? I haven't seen one yet, but I have seen a lot of journalism that's done a lot of good. And it does go back to reporting. Let's find out what the facts are. Let's tell people what the facts are. Ultimately, the public gets to make these decisions about what to do, where we're heading as a society, who we elect to govern us, all of that. Not our call to make that decision. Our job is to give people the information they need and deserve to know in a democracy. And so that's where I think that's our lane. And I think we should stay in that lane and not become, those of us who work in the news department should not, as opposed to, let's say, opinion writers and editorial writers and people like that, we should stay in the lane of reporting hard, reporting aggressively, doing our job, and telling the public what we find directly, forthrightly, unflinchingly. And I think there's a lot that can be accomplished with that. It has been throughout history. That kind of reporting has accomplished a lot. And I haven't seen much accomplished by going on social media and expressing people's personal views.
In fact, you write here, too often, this is from your book, too often it became a venue for personal opinions, advocacy, anger, sniping, failed humor, virtue signaling, personal animus, and a rush to judgment. Never more so than during the Trump years. there came a point where colleagues, your colleagues, my colleagues, people in other newsrooms, not all, but some, really felt that being forthright and being truthful required, in some ways, something that went beyond a strict recitation of facts or syntheses of analyses, and it required, in some ways, lived experience and personal understanding of things to make things more powerful and authentic, and that was the distance between the media and the audience they felt. You come out in a different place in this book. Explain why.
I think people's personal experiences are highly relevant. That's why we really need a diverse staff in a newsroom. We need people from all different backgrounds who have lived different lives. There are stories that other people will detect that I wouldn't even be aware of. There are perspectives that other people have that I couldn't possibly have. We should bring that all of that should be brought into our newsroom, and we should discuss that among ourselves and talk about that as the kinds of stories that we should pursue and how we should pursue those stories and things like that. But the stories that we do, they have to conform to institutional standards. These are well-established standards in our newsrooms. When you walk into the Washington Post, there's a name, the Washington Post, on the building. What does that mean? Does that mean something, or does it mean nothing? Are we just a random collection of individuals working in a building that has Washington Post on its name? Or does working in that building mean that we actually work as a team, that we work collaboratively, that we discuss things collectively, that we make decisions in a collaborative way, as opposed to each individual expressing themselves on social media, however they want, whenever they want, on whatever subject they want, all of that. Generally impulsively, instantaneously. That to me is not journalism. That's something else entirely. In many instances, it's advocacy. And that's not our role. I think we can accomplish a lot if we discuss all of this together. As I said, we need a very diverse staff. We need people from different backgrounds. They do need to bring up these subjects so that we can discuss them. They can inform our coverage and do inform our coverage. But every person just going off on their own, doing their own thing, means that you're not really functioning you're not functioning as an institution. It's just a bunch of individuals who work there saying whatever it is they want, however they want, whenever they want.
So let's take a stock for a moment about where the Trump years and its successors have left us. We are at a time where it feels like we are awash with misinformation, and whether it's recent events in Israel and Gaza, whether it's the fight between Ukraine and Russia, questions about vaccines in this country, questions about the elections past and upcoming. And even as the Post and other media organizations do what they are laboring their best to do, which is rigorous, factual-based reporting, they are also fallible. How do we, at a time of so many attacks on the media and its credibility, how does the press or journalists work to establish credibility with more than those who feel that their rooting interests are represented in any given story?
Yeah, well, it's a fundamental question for our profession right now, clearly very important. I think, first of all, it's important to remember something that you just said, and that is we are fallible. We are human beings. The reason we make mistakes, just like every other human being makes mistakes. It doesn't mean there's a conspiracy. It doesn't mean there's animus. It doesn't mean, incompetence. It doesn't mean any of that. It means that people are human and they make mistakes. And the important thing to do is to correct those when you become aware of them, if in fact they are mistakes. So that's one step that we certainly should take. And we should recognize our own fallibilities and our own limitations, and recognize that I think it's very important that we go into our journalism asking the right questions, not assuming that we have the answers, but go seeking those answers. Asking the right questions is a hard enough job. Knowing what those questions are. We are often seeing the world through a keyhole. That's certainly the case in many areas in the Middle East, particularly in Gaza, because covering that place now is just extraordinarily difficult. I think we need to, in this country, I think we in the press need to get out more into the community. We need to talk to all people in all corners of our society, regardless of I mean, all races, all ethnicities, people of all classes, all experiences, you name it, and all professions, and try to get a sense of their concerns, their worries, but also their expectations and their hopes, and reflect that very fairly, and without any condescension in our or judgment about them, in our pages and on the air and what on our sites, what have you. So I think that's important for us to do. Another thing that's important for us to do is to lay out the evidence for people. We have the tools now where we can show people things that we could not show them before. So if we're covering a court hearing, we can show them the evidence that's been presented in court. We can show them the ruling. We can annotate that ruling to highlight the particularly relevant portions of that ruling. We have access to videos. We have access to audio that we can present online, so that people, if they don't trust us, they can go watch it for themselves, listen for themselves, read it for themselves. So we need to be as transparent as we possibly can, and in almost every instance, because we should just go into this with the assumption that people won't trust us. So we're presenting here it is, here's the evidence, here's the basis on which I wrote this story. So those are some of the things that I think that we ought to be doing.
A couple of quick questions before we wrap up. Among the things that you expressed admiration for Jeff Bezos' stewardship of the Post was that he didn't treat it simply as a charity. You know, this guy could cut checks for a very long time before he noticed anything really diminishing his tens of billions of dollars of personal wealth. And yet he said this has to be a viable enterprise. And under your stewardship and Trump years, you know, the Post grew in size, in stature, in digital subscriptions, which is really the mother lode for most newspapers at the moment, seeking viability and some sort of financial stability. And that looked pretty good. In recent days and weeks, we've learned that the Post, obviously, well, since your departure, but has embarked on an effort to buy out 240 of its employees, about half of which will come from the newsroom. That'll represent roughly 10% of the newsroom. And they'd also had a more modest reduction of staff earlier this year. Bezos's appointed acting CEO said essentially our anticipated growth in revenues and in particularly subscriptions were just wildly out of whack. They couldn't stand up to real scrutiny as things now look. What do you see now at a slight remove in terms of what conclusions we should draw, or what we should how we should assess the Post's strengths and stability at the moment?
Well, I think it remains very stable because it's owned by such a wealthy individual. Also, I think that it has a great franchise. I think it's important to remember, as you say, that the Post grew tremendously over the years. We had 6 straight years of profitability. That money was all reinvested. When I got there were about 580 people on the staff. We were having to make cuts, about 35 in the first year. And then probably another 50 or more in every year in the years ahead. Even after the cutbacks that they'll have at the Post now in the newsroom, they'll be left with, I believe, about 940 people, which is not far off from where it was when I left. That still represents significant growth for the Post and a very strong foundation for sustainability. They did overinvest. They didn't adequately prepare for a post-Trump era. A lot of the growth at the Post was driven by keen interest in politics, desire to hold Trump accountable, all of that. We needed to prepare better for a post-Trump era. It was particularly apparent for 2 reasons. One, after 2018, when the GOP lost the House. And then, of course, we could see, for example, at the New York Times, that they were diversifying. They had invested hugely in a cooking app. They had acquired Wirecutter, a product recommendation service. They had started a games initiative building on their famous New York Times crossword puzzle. All of that. They were basically insinuating themselves into people's daily routines in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with news. That was evident years ago. And we did need to prepare for that. I urged us to prepare for that. I think that there was a sense that things were going fine at the Post because we did have 6 straight years of profitability. But we did diversify. We did invest in a lot of different things. We expanded our technology coverage tremendously. We added some other things, but it was not to the same extent as the New York Times. And so now they have to make an adjustment. Because they did overinvest, they did overexpect in terms of what their subscriptions would be and what traffic would be like. And I think it's important to not just to project from one year's performance into the future. I mean, I think it's important to recall that people predicted the Post would slide into oblivion. That was about the time that I arrived, and people were looking at it very pessimistically. And also even the New York Times. It wasn't that long ago that people were saying the New York Times would slide into bankruptcy and that it would be overtaken by BuzzFeed News and Huffington Post and all the upstart digital outfits. That didn't happen. The New York Times turned itself around. What that tells me is that we shouldn't just extrapolate from one year's financial difficulties into the future, but that we should understand that news organizations can turn themselves around. And I think that the Post will. I think that Bezos is very committed to the future of the Post. He said so many times. I believe that. And right now they have to make some sort of adjustment and, look and debate whether it's the right approach or not. But clearly, if you're expected to lose, as they've projected, $100 million this year, that's probably not a good call to do nothing.
So let me ask you this last brief question, Marty Baron. What surprised you as you had time to reflect, as you pulled away from decades of hurtling headlong into these daily deadlines and long-term enterprise investigations? What insight surprised you about your own tenure or about your own trade of journalism for all these years?
I don't know that it was a surprise. I mean, I think that I reflected a lot on the tensions within our profession. I think a lot of it is a reaction to Donald Trump and his attack on the press and his attack on norms, political norms in this country, and worries about what his movement, if you want to call it that, could usher in for the United States. And so, I certainly found myself grappling with that and what my own views were on that and how other people view it differently. But I came to the conclusion that I don't want to say I came to the conclusion that I was right, but I do have some firm views on that. And I think it's really important for us while we have to change the way that we deliver information to the public, technology is changing that. People want to receive their information on different devices and in different forms, and we have to change with that. And our jobs are going to change. But I think we should adhere to the traditional values. I don't think the response to Trump's obliteration of norms should lead to the press obliterating its own norms, its own standards, abandoning those standards. I think we should stick to those standards. If we veer from those standards, I think we run a real risk of merely contributing to the erosion of democracy in this country.
Marty Baron, thanks so much.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for listening to this week's Q&A podcast. Remember, Q&A will be back with all new episodes starting January 28th.